Breaking news, folks! After working tirelessly for months in my secret lab, I have finally succeeded in turning my webcomics main character Vector into a plushie! He's little, he's soft, he's marketable, and he can be yours for a limited time over on Makeship. However, this is a limited edition plush, and as such, he's only available during the month of February. Once the sales period is over, he's gone for good, folks! Head down to the Makeship link in the description and snag a Vector of your very own before time runs out. Bring this sweet little guy into your life today! I love webcomics. I adore them, genuinely. In the current state of artistic industries falling apart and being gutted by greedy corporations and churning out nothing but sequel after sequel, indie productions like webcomics feel like this beacon of hope in a darkened landscape. Anyone can make a webcomic and post it online without having to worry about a huge production or publication, and it can be a great way to get your dream story out there in the world. But webcomics can still be a tricky thing to jump into, and especially when you're first starting out, it can be hard to know exactly what you should or shouldn't be doing. Which is where I come in. Hi, I'm Star, and I've been making comics and posting them online for over 15 years, and one of my favorite things to do is to take all the little things I've learned making comics over the years and pass them on to you folks, so you don't make the same mistakes that I did. I've covered this topic in the past, and today we'll be covering a few more do's and don'ts for those of you who are hoping to start a webcomic in the future, or folks who have started one already but are hoping to learn more about the medium. I'll leave links for my previous videos on this topic in the description if you'd like to check those out as well, but for today, let's talk webcomics. Before we dive in really quick, let's do Hey Star, what you drawing? The artwork in the background is the art from my webcomic Castoff's February Mail Club set, featuring Marina and Ariana in some cute Love Corey Valentine's outfits. You can get these stickers and a signed copy of the print by joining my Patreon this month, and check out the full comic for free on the website. Links for both of these are in the description, but for now, you can enjoy watching the speed paint while I ramble. So, let's get into it. Tip number 1. Don't force yourself into an art method you dislike. Now, this one might seem obvious at first, but let me tell you guys a story. In my previous webcomic tutorial videos, I've gotten a lot of people asking things like, does my webcomic have to be in color? Or, am I allowed to do my comic this way? With the rise of published comics on platforms like Webtoon pushing out high-quality artwork at a super fast pace, a lot of newbie comic artists are coming into the hobby with the expectation that their webcomic has to look a certain way to get readers. The comic has to be in color, and every page has to be meticulously rendered to look absolutely perfect. At this point, it almost feels like there's a stigma against black and white comics, implying that they're somehow lesser than colored ones. And can I be honest? I hate that. Making your comic in color isn't a requirement. Hell, one of the guiding principles of webcomics is that you can basically do whatever you want. If you don't like working in color, don't force yourself to use color. There's so many beautiful comics done in black and white or with limited spot colors. I'll throw a few examples up on the screen. You want more examples of beautiful comics done solely in black and white to prove your comic doesn't have to be in color? Look at pretty much any manga. Those are done almost exclusively in black and white, and you don't hear their readers complain. Like I said before, webcomics are an extremely freeing medium. There's no rules to how your comic has to be done. Another example I hear a lot is people assuming webcomics have to be drawn digitally, which is also ridiculous. If you hate working in digital, you can do your comics on paper and scan them. You don't need to force yourself to use digital just because other folks do. Here's just a few examples of comics done in traditional mediums. Like, this could be you. Don't force yourself to use a medium or art method you dislike just because it's popular. Make the choices that will make you happy and follow the artistic path that brings you joy. Next up is one that a lot of folks may take for granted, but that I've had first-hand personal experience with. Tip number 2, keep a regular update schedule. Let me tell you guys a little story. When I first started my first webcomic, I didn't really have any kind of update schedule. I worked on the comic when I had time and posted pages when they were done. Sometimes I'd post 3 pages in a week, and sometimes I'd go over a month without updating. I didn't really know the value of consistent, regular updates until I started getting comments from my readers saying, hey, I like this comic, but it's really annoying not knowing when the next page will be out. Do you think you could post the pages on some kind of schedule so we know when to come back for new updates? So I did. I started dedicating 1 day a week to the webcomic, waking up early, drawing an entire page in 1 day, and posting it online when I was done. And sure enough, the consistency of posting a new page on the same day every week really worked out. My readers appreciated the consistency, and my pages would get more likes and comments as a result. The increased engagement was a good motivator to keep up the consistency, and I've stuck to a regular upload schedule for my comics ever since. This is something that makes sense for us as artists and is also considerate for your readers. But what kind of update schedule should you use for your comic? Honestly, it depends on what you can manage. There's no right or wrong answer here. A good starting point is 1 page per week, but I know plenty of comics that upload larger batches of pages every 2 weeks or once a month. It really depends on what you can handle with your schedule and how much you can reasonably do consistently. If you're just starting out, I'd recommend starting with a slower schedule, maybe 1 page every 2 weeks or 2 pages once a month. As you get used to the comic making process, you can gradually up your schedule until you find something that's a good balance of speed and workload. The important thing is that you don't burn yourself out. Webcomics are a marathon, not a sprint, and trying to operate at 100% capacity constantly is the fast track to a really bad burnout. Be reasonable with yourself, figure out what you can handle, and do your best to work efficiently to save time. Okay, all that said, let's move on to tip number 3. Don't be afraid to draw new things. So, if you've never drawn comics before, chances are you might underestimate how much new stuff comics will force you to draw. If you've mostly ever done character art or illustrations, I bet there's a ton of things you've never drawn before. How well can you draw a mechanical pencil from memory? Or a hand holding that pencil? Working on a scene where you need to draw a character driving? Well, now you have to draw not just the outside, but also the inside of the car. Do you know what a steering wheel looks like? What about a car seat? Where does the seatbelt even come out of, anyway? Can you draw a bike? A character's hand at this very specific angle? What about a windmill? A trout? A fancy castle? If you're going to include something in your comic, you're gonna need to draw that thing. And while that may sound really intimidating, try thinking of it this way. Comics are a great way to learn how to draw things you might not have ever drawn otherwise. It's like working out muscles you never knew existed. And I know, that probably still sounds really intimidating, but just because you've never drawn something before doesn't mean you need to be scared of it. Just remember that a good first step to learning to draw something is gathering references. It's not cheating to look up what something looks like, despite what some very strange people on the internet like to say. Use references, they're good for you. And speaking of references, that's a perfect segue to talking about today's sponsor, Milanote. Milanote is a super handy tool for organizing all your creative projects. If you're the kind of person who plots out stories using things like sticky notes on a wall, Milanote functions like a digital version of that, with lots of tools to help keep everything organized. You can start by making a new board and either choose from one of their handy templates or start completely from scratch and go wild, adding in pictures, text, to-do list, flowchart arrows, color coding, even collapsible columns and subboards. Whatever way you like to organize your reference materials, Milanote's got you covered. I can personally vouch for how useful the platform is since I've actually been using it pretty consistently for the last few months. I used to just keep all my reference images in a folder on my computer, but since I didn't have the ability to take notes that way, I would sometimes forget why I saved certain references in the first place. And then when it was time to actually use my references, I'd get lost just scrolling through a bunch of random pictures with no context for what I actually liked about each reference. But Milanote lets you draw on, crop, and attach notes to each item you add to your boards, keeping them super organized and letting you focus in on the important stuff. For example, I used Milanote to gather references for the outfits and the art you've been watching me draw in this video. I went digging around and found clothing items and color schemes I liked and wanted to include in the art, made a big board to compile them all together and take notes on what I liked about each image, and even made a subboard to gather references for all the little sweeps and border effects. And I can even share my reference boards with my patrons as a way to show my process for each month's mail club set. Plus, if you're collaborating with other people on a webcomic or some other creative project, Milanote's collaborative boards are the perfect way to make sure you're all on the same page. If you're trying to plot out a story, design a character, fill out a background, or do just about any sort of work that involves using a lot of references, Milanote is a great way to keep everything in one easy-to-access place. Milanote is available for free with no time limit, so check my link in the description to try it out for yourself. Alright, time for tip number 4. Keep your names easy to remember. This one seems simple, but it's a pretty important one. When making a comic, or really any kind of story, it's a good idea to keep the title simple and easy to both remember and spell. Consider a hypothetical scenario where someone recently read your webcomic and is trying to recommend it to their friend, a potential new reader. If your comic's name is something simple and using just a few words, it'll be much easier for that friend to remember and look up later. But if you name your comic something like The Dire Predicaments of Sire Charging Gargle and Lady Farflebuttering, that's a bit of a mouthful that's going to be hard to remember and type into Google or something. I just told you the name of this hypothetical comic and you guys have already forgotten it, haven't you? This is what we professionals in the industry would call a bad idea. If you want people to read your comic, you need to make it easy to find, and a big part of that is making the title memorable and easily searchable. A small addition to this is to Google your comic's hypothetical name to see what else comes up in the search engines before committing to a title. If your comic, hypothetically shares its name with, a viral Korean music artist, you might be shooting yourself in the foot and making it nearly impossible for your comic to be easily searchable. Not that I would know what that's like, or anything. But this naming advice also relates to things within the comic itself. If your characters' names are hard to remember, don't be surprised when readers can't, remember them. If two characters have really similar names, don't be surprised if commenters get the names mixed up. If a character or place name is hard to spell, don't be surprised when people misspell it constantly in the comments. I mean, I keep my character names pretty simple, and even then I still get people misspelling their names. Ah yes, I love my comic characters, Victor, Adriana, and Frank. Yes, I've been making this comic for almost 10 years, and I still get people misspelling the main characters' names after they read over 800 pages of the dang thing, but it's fine. Basically, keep the names in your comic simple, and people will have a simpler time finding and reading it. And on a similar note, tip number 5, make your character designs distinct. Remember what I said about characters with similar names getting mixed up by readers? Well, the same can also happen with your character's visuals. If your character's designs are too close to each other, it can be hard to tell them apart, leading to your readers getting them mixed up with each other and causing confusion. Some advice for this? Make a lineup image of all the characters in your main cast. A good place to start is making sure your character silhouettes are all visually distinct. If you black out the shapes of your characters, can you still tell who's who? If not, it's a good idea to play with their shapes and body types. Make some characters taller or shorter, change up their body types, make some characters fatter or skinnier than others, and some characters more muscular or more willowy. Take their personalities and ways of life into account. A character who has a very physically demanding job would probably be more muscular than the person who sits behind a desk for work, for example. Vary their hairstyles and give them distinctive articles of clothing. Even if your art style is more realistic, there's still a lot you can do to keep their silhouettes varied. In addition to that, giving them distinct color palettes is also a good idea. Giving all your characters different silhouettes is a great starting point, but even that can be hindered if all your characters have the same color scheme. Change up their hair and eye colors, vary their skin tones and clothing color schemes. Try to have a good variety of designs present across your cast. Faces are also a huge part of character design. Try to vary your face, eye, and nose shapes. How does their hair affect how their face looks? What about their chin and jawline? How thick or thin are their eyebrows? How can changing the proportions of their features reflect their personality? A really basic example of this is how a character with larger eyes looks more innocent or feminine, whereas a character with smaller eyes can look older or more serious. Don't be afraid to get out of your comfort zone and mix things up. And one last tip to cap it off, make sure you keep these things consistent. I can speak to personal experience on this one. If I don't use references for my characters, I have a bad habit of falling back into a comfortable default body type or face shape, especially for characters I don't draw super frequently. Design your characters and make the effort to keep them consistent. Your readers will thank you for it, and you'll thank yourself too. Next up, tip number 6, keep it short. All the epic fantasy fans watching this are preparing to riot, but before you come at me with pitchforks, let me explain. Webcomics take time. How much time? And more than you'd think. Like, take the amount of time you think it'll take to finish your comic and multiply it by 2, maybe even 3. It is a time-consuming medium. Let's say that you write a script for one chapter of your webcomic, then break that script up into 30 comic pages. That doesn't sound so bad, right? Well, let's do the math here. If you update your comic once per week, that's 30 weeks to post that entire chapter. That's over half a year. And that's assuming you keep your chapters pretty short and snappy. If your chapters are 50 pages, for example, that one chapter will take you an entire year to post, and that's assuming you don't take any breaks. And if your planned story has 25 chapters that each take a year to post, well, I really, really hope you like making this webcomic. When you're dealing with a medium that takes so much time on top of whatever real-life commitments you have, it's smart to cut the fluff as much as possible. Kill your darlings, as it were. Now, I'm not saying you have to keep your story completely bare bones, not saying that at all, a little fluff is good for you, but it's good to be mindful of the time you'd need to spend to make each scene you're putting in, as well as how long it'll take to get through that scene for your readers. But how do you know what bits to cut? Well, when I'm writing, I always think about the value and purpose for each scene I put in. Ideally, your audience should get something of value from each scene. What am I showing the audience with this scene? What are they learning from it? If you're looking at your outline and finding scenes where not a lot of value happens, you may find it better to just cut that scene entirely. But Star, I really like this scene! Even if it's not super important, it might drag down the narrative, I still think it's fun and would like to include it. And I'm not saying you can't. I'm not the arbiter of what you do with your story. Again, you just need to be mindful. If you really like a scene but it drags down your main story, you might consider why you have it there. Alternatively, you could try making it a little bonus side comic instead of part of the main story. Stuff like that is great if you have a Patreon or if you need to go on hiatus for some reason. In short, keep it short and you'll probably have a better time. Consider this your warning from someone who has been in these trenches. Just saying. Okay, that said, let's keep it going. Tip number 7, give each character a goal. One of my favorite tips for writing, especially if you have your characters but are having trouble coming up with a story for them, is to make sure each character has a goal. And then, once they have a goal, think about how that goal ties into their story. What do they want? Why do they want it? Why is it so important to them? How do they plan to get it? And what's standing in their way? What will they refuse to do to get it? And what are the consequences for both success and failure to achieve it? Figuring out these elements can be a great way to hash out a storyline. I have actually gotten pushback on this advice before though, with people saying, not every character needs a goal, real people don't always have goals. To which my response has always been, characters are not real people. Characters are vehicles for telling a story, and for them to have a place in that story, they should have some kind of goal or something they want. Even if it doesn't get a lot of focus in the story, you might not focus as much on the goals for your side characters, for example. Fleshing out your characters, especially your protagonists, by giving them something they want is a good way to inform their actions and how they'll handle certain situations. If you want an example, here's some goals for the members of my comic cast-off. Every single one of them has a goal, even if some characters aren't as focused on as the others. And these goals don't need to be super high stakes either. Your character's goal can be something as big as, I need to save the world from this dastardly villain intent on destroying it. Or they can be as simple as, I want to go to prom with Stacy. Think about how their goal motivates them, how they plan to get it, and how that goal lines up with or clashes with other members of your cast. Basically, if you're struggling with your story, it's always good to think about the goal. And speaking of planning storylines, let's talk about a big one. Tip number 8, give characters agency by using because statements. This one will probably require a bit of explanation, so let me give you an example storyline. Bob is a simple man from a farming village. And then one day, Bob leaves his village. And then, while traveling, Bob meets a famous adventurer. And then the adventurer teaches Bob how to fight using a sword. This is an example of a story held together with and then statements. A happens, then B happens, then C happens. Bob leaves his village and then he meets the adventurer and then the adventurer teaches him to fight. And while it's okay as a starting point, we don't really know what's driving Bob. Why did he leave his village? Why did the adventurer teach him how to fight? It all just sort of happens, and there's nothing really compelling Bob to do any of these things aside from the writer told him to. This is one of those problems that's easy to spot once you know to look for it, and it can really drag a story down. A story written with because statements would be more like this. A happens, and because of that, B happens, and because of B, C happens. Let's try reworking that synopsis from before with this method in mind. Bob is a simple man from a farming village. But one day, a dragon appears and burns Bob's village to the ground. Because he wants revenge on the dragon, Bob leaves his village to hunt it down. Because Bob leaves his village, he's attacked by bandits who prey on travelers. Because Bob gets attacked, an adventurer swoops in to help save him. And because the adventurer saves him, Bob asks the adventurer to teach him how to defend himself. Do you see the difference? In our first example, Bob is just a leaf in the breeze, going to and fro without any real drive or reasoning behind his actions. But in our second example, the one built on a chain of because statements, Bob has agency in his story. We understand why he's doing the things he's doing, and the story is driven by the actions he's taking. As a writing exercise, try writing out the basic outline of your own story and see if you can make any improvements by incorporating more because statements. Building your plotline off the consequences of the actions your characters take is a good way to keep things interesting and compelling. We're getting close to the end here, so here's one I feel pretty strongly about. Tip number 9, don't shy away from tropes. If you aren't familiar, a trope in this context refers to commonly used themes or story elements. Stuff like a chosen one, enemies to lovers, evil guys having red eyes, isekai stories where the main character is reincarnated as the story's villain, etc. Tropes by themselves aren't inherently bad. Some people will love certain tropes and others won't, and some really common or quote overused tropes can get a bad reputation if they're commonly done poorly or uninterestingly. Overused tropes can come with a lot of stigma. People will read a story with a certain trope they dislike and think, "Aw man, here we go again," because of other pieces of media they dislike, including that trope. And no matter how loud these detractors can be, it's important to remember that this is always a matter of taste. And taste is subjective. I'll say again, tropes are not inherently bad, and if you love a certain trope, you shouldn't shy away from using it just because there's a vocal crowd of people who are loud about disliking it. I'll give you an example. I've talked about this before, but I love me a good amnesia story. With a big emphasis on the good, there are definitely some bad examples out there, but a lot of people hate amnesia as a trope, either because in their experience it's usually done badly, or because they just don't find it interesting. And those people are allowed to have that opinion, but I am allowed to disagree, and I do. And if I wanted, I would be well within my right to include amnesia as much as I wanted in any given story that I create, because it's my story, and I'm not making it for those people. I'm making it for me and my cast full of 12 amnesiac characters are gonna go have so much fun over there and not worry about the amnesia haters. There's a post I saw recently that said something along the lines of, "Don't write defensively for an audience that hates what you make, write passionately for those who love it." Why would you waste your time trying to appeal to people who aren't gonna like the work you make anyway? The best thing you can do is write passionately and guiltlessly about the things you love, that you want to make a story about so badly. Make your work as self-indulgent as possible. Love what you make shamelessly. You'd be surprised by how many people will vibe with the same things you do, and your audience will only grow from there. And lastly, to top off this video with one of the arguably most important tips I have, tip number 10, don't worry about originality. Let me hit you with a story summary. In a world where people are gifted powers beyond normal human abilities, characters attend a special school to learn how to use their powers. Now, what story was I referencing just there? X-Men? My Hero Academia? Any of the dozens of YA Magic School series? It doesn't matter. Point is, no matter which series jumped into your head first from that description, they all have the same basic formula. People with powers at a school to learn how to use them. And while they all share a basic premise, the presentation of that premise is remarkably different for each one, depending on the person who created them and their goals in telling that story. And you may be thinking to yourself, "Okay, Star, what's your point?" My point is that you don't need to worry about originality. A good story is a good story, regardless if it's similar to something else that's been told before. What matters is the presentation and the way you tell that story. I have people in my comments all the time telling me I'm worried my ideas aren't good enough, or my characters and story aren't original enough, and that's the thing! They don't have to be! How many retellings of Shakespeare's plays have there been? How many Greek myth retellings can you find in any medium? How many dozens of different Sherlock Holmes adaptations exist? And despite how many of those there are, people still love them because the way the story is told is different every time. Instead of worrying about telling a story that's never ever been told before, focus on telling an engaging story, a fun story, something that's a combination of all the things you love that will make you happy. And if you're still struggling with exactly how you want to tell that story or how to approach your ideas, the best way to get around that is to read more stories. Read comics. Read so many comics, as many as you can. Rather than hiding from reading other webcomics for fear of becoming unoriginal or unintentionally copying off them, embrace the inspiration that can only come with engaging with other stories in your preferred medium. If you want to broaden your horizons and get into reading more comics, I'd recommend checking out the Webcomic Travelogue, a website dedicated to helping people find new comics to read. Just for the record, this is not sponsored, this is just a project put together by some people that I know that I wanted to give a shout out. You can search by genre, format, and even specific tags to find stories you'll enjoy, or you can leave it up to fate and pick something random to read. And if you find a comic you like, see if that creator lists their own recommendations anywhere. There's so many amazing comics out there just waiting for you to discover them. Broaden your horizons, absorb more stories, and use them as inspiration to tell something unique to you. So that's about it for my webcomic advice, and this is the part of the video where I'd usually promote a comic I like, but I'd like to do something a little different this time. If you're watching this video and hoping to make a webcomic of your own someday, you might be looking for even more advice from other creatives in the space. And if that's the case, I can happily recommend the Screen Tones webcomic podcast. They've got episodes covering all kinds of topics and a rotating cast of hosts with a wide variety of experiences who all pitch in to share their knowledge. I was actually a guest on a few episodes in the past, but as of this year, I've officially joined in as one of their regular cast members. So you can expect even more yapping from me in the future over on their channels. I'll have links for all of that in the description. Also, of course, I'd be remiss to not mention my book, How to Webcomic here. A few years ago, I wrote a book that includes all my best advice for making webcomics all in one convenient package. A lot of the points from this video are recycled from points I make in that book, so if you want to dive even deeper into the production of webcomics and get all the advice I have to offer in one place, you can snag a digital or physical copy from my store. Link is down in the description. And as thanks for staying this long into the video, I'll have a coupon code on screen that you can use to save a few bucks. But all that said, it's time to wrap up. Thanks for joining me for more webcomic advice, friends. Remember to check out the links in the description for all the comics and resources I mentioned during this video, including this video's sponsor, Millinote. If you'd like to get the artwork from this video, as well as a bunch of other cool rewards, you can join my Patreon at patreon.com/castoff, and read my entire webcomic for free at castoff-comic.com. Also, if you're already familiar with the comic, remember that Vector plushies are available now on Makeship until the end of the month. Special thanks to all my Patreon members for their support, and a special thank you to my video shout-out to your patrons: Jared, Holly, Mr. Don Matsu, Leaf, Azure Knight Ruby, and Alyssa Herzog. Thank you for helping keep my two little cat daughters fed and appropriately spoiled. But that's all from me for now. Fare thee well, friends, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!